Hi, I'm Quinn and I'm autistic. Welcome to Autistic. This video should work on its own, but it also follows on directly from the video linked up here, right now, and in the description. You might want to catch up with the story so far before you watch the rest. Someone commented on a video recently about how little anyone knew about their Asperger's diagnosis when they received it in 1994. The same year, both Asperger's syndrome and the autism spectrum were added to the DSM-4. The lack of practical support available to them 30 years ago is something a lot of us can still relate to now, whatever age we are. It reminded me of a conversation with a group of autistic folks from a few years back. Over a series of chats, we'd noted that life had presented us with many of the same barriers, the same kinds of mishaps and similar prejudice. The majority of the group were diagnosed in adulthood, and most of those in my age group found out they were autistic relatively recently. Because I masked for so many of those long years between teen diagnosis and middle-aged present, my difficulties almost always arose with people who didn't know I was a card-carrying autist at the time. So they would have happened anyway. I wondered if perhaps my dusty old diagnosis hadn't made as big of a difference as perhaps it could have. I remain grateful to this day to have been corrected. I hadn't thought it through fully, but once I had talked it through and thought it through, I got it. You see, if an outside observer were to relate the stories of our lives, they might paint them with broadly similar strokes. The events, the decisions and the outcomes that they watch play out form a pattern over time, a shared incongruence to their perception of normal that would tie our tales together. They'd recognise that we stood out from the crowd in similar ways, but that prior knowledge of our diagnoses didn't appear to alter the material outcome of decisive moments much. That's what I had in mind when I first commented. That observer's perspective. But an observer lacks personal insight, has no knowledge of the internal goings-on in our respective minds, which I now know were very different. All those years that things were going wrong for them for no apparent reason, I had a context to frame them in. There may not have been much information available to me at first, and no one to talk it through with, but at least I had something to cling to. I knew it wasn't just me when they didn't. Getting a clear picture of what being autistic meant and how much it influenced the course of my turbulent path through life turned out to be a tall order, but that little group of autists helped me understand that as tangible as my frustration was and is at how little we know and how much garbage is peddled, for them, this whole autism thing was something new. And even the shockingly incomplete picture we have now is far preferable to the void in which they lived before. Having a name for what made me different allowed me the privilege of hope. Hope for better knowledge, hope for change, and hope that I could meet someone else I could relate to, because that diagnosis took away the guesswork. Even if the chances really were 10,000 to 1, as was thought back then, it was still a chance that I'd meet someone else who could say, "I'm autistic," and I'd not be alone in my confusion anymore. In the 70s, 80s and 90s, when my then undiagnosed friends and I had floated alone in our life rafts through the oceans of experience, adrift in the same fog of social expectations, logical fallacies and contradictions, my diagnosis was the telescope that penetrated the mists of confusion, allowing me to see the distant lands we're drifting towards. If I hadn't known I was autistic, I'd have been as lost as everyone else. Being diagnosed with anything like this back in the 80s wasn't like it is now. You had what the specialist told you, and hopefully your GP, teachers, or whoever would be up to speed once they learned of it. My dad took the news badly, cutting me off from contact with the specialist who diagnosed me, and my school didn't have a clue what it meant. So I had to set about the arduous task of figuring out which bits of me were autistic and which weren't on my Jack Jones. I started with the premise of, if I do it but other people don't, it might be the autism. Of course, much of what had been described in damning terms by a succession of responsible adults was now contextualised by the word autistic. So clearly the things that caused me trouble in life must be the autistic bits that I had to overcome in order to succeed, or at least to stop getting shouted at so much. My task was to learn to discriminate between what was autistic, and therefore bad, and what might just be acceptable quirks of my personality I could ignore. A simple equation. Identify the bad, eliminate it, and the leftover balance would be the good and the indifferent. The internet age was barely even imagined when I was diagnosed. There were no support groups. Not one formal body was even close to recognising the autism spectrum yet, and outside of hard-to-get academic journals, there wasn't much in print that described my situation. I ploughed through what I could get from the library in regards to autism and supplemented that with psychology, anthropology, neurology, wherever the threads led me. I needed to know what was so different about me that I constantly attracted trouble without trying. Why following the rules so often backfired on me, and why my honesty wasn't even recognised much of the time, let alone earning the trust I'd always been led to expect. So I pursued two distinct but parallel avenues of inquiry. One into autistic psychology and development, that which was specific to people like me and was supposedly the root of my unhappiness. The other focused on what we knew about brains and consciousness in general, the normal to my abnormal in crude and unpleasant, but period-accurate terms. Across popular psychology and the serious academic literature of the time, the study of the human mind in the last quarter of the 20th century shifted increasingly towards the role of feelings and bias in our lives and the influence of long past events on future decisions and outcomes. It was enabling and empowering. Psychology was a tool that made sense of our motivations and our decisions, helped us master our failings and rise above our insecurities. Knowledge is power, and the sheer depth of potential promised by psychology offered peace of mind and self-determination for people struggling with the weight of difficult emotions, troublesome memories, or a lack of control in their lives. The autism literature of the time was quite the contrast. Reams of ghastly descriptions of unfortunate children, abandoned to residential institutions by exasperated parents or overzealous authorities, to be prodded, examined and observed. It wasn't a collaborative, optimistic view like the psychology books. It was a top-down view, a scientist's view of specimens under study. At times, the language used could chill your bones, especially the way it handled the humanity of the subjects of their case studies. It didn't consider the autistic people they wrote about as part of the we or us of fellow stakeholders in society. It was them and they. Child A, B and C, a whole alphabet of lost lives. And the idea that they may be allowed a choice in their futures, let alone being able to take control of their destinies, was unthinkable. No doubt whatsoever was cast on the self-evident truth that the inconvenient behaviours and communication differences attributed to autism were both pathological and in need of remedy. It seems pitiful now, but it was significant progress when the once popular refrigerator mother theory that autism was the product of maternal neglect was finally put aside for a more nature over nurture view of autism as heredity became increasingly apparent. I've never had any difficulty believing that autism was in my genes. I know my family history after all. But many of the items on their lists of symptoms, the items I've related to at least, weren't exactly pathological in my view. For me, they were often conscious decisions made with good reason. OK, there were things I couldn't explain in those papers and books from the library, like my sensory and interoceptive differences, my digestive issues, or alexithymia, but they weren't even recognised as connected to autism back then. I knew that if anyone had been bothered to ask, no, let's be honest about it. If anybody had actually listened to me crying and pleading for a chance to explain before the strap left welts on my arse cheeks, they might have stopped to think that I might not have been maladjusted or defective. Given the chance, I would have explained every decision, behaviour or choice of phrase they were unhappy about. The more I learned of those alphabet children, the more I understood how close I became to being another anonymous child A, B or C understudy myself, because stripped of the pathologising, the infantilising and the judgmental theorising, I could see how similar we were. For a long while, I retreated from my diagnosis. I hid who I was for years, and my understanding of what it means to be autistic changed a lot whilst I watched from the sidelines. Over the years, I wore many different faces. I've worn the bitter, angry face of a young man who resented the roll of the genetic dice that left him lumbered with this autistic stone around his neck. I've also been the equally angry and annoying young man who resented the world that ignored his self-proclaimed insight and brilliance in favour of pretty boys or popular girls with half the ability. I've worn the yoke of unrealistic expectations and ignorance in the face of the obvious as a son, a pupil, an employee, and as a patient. I've been sacked for telling the truth, abused for challenging prejudice, and been the friend who was banished for trying to save others from injustice. I've been the wonderfully sensitive boyfriend and the selfish, thoughtless cad, the shoulder to cry on and the slimy backstabber, the paragon of virtuous loyalty and the viper in the nest, all at the same time, and without knowing how I could be so many contradictory things all at once. I've known a full spectrum of social embarrassments, and I can tell you what it feels like when that embarrassment doesn't register until 25 years later. I felt shame at being autistic, pride in being autistic, and tried really hard to be ambivalent about it. I've revealed it partially, subtly, blatantly, and dramatically when I wasn't keeping it a secret. I've been furious about it, comforted by it, vexed by it, overcome by it, depressed about it, enlightened by it, troubled by it, elated by it, not bothered by it, unable to think of anything else but it. All of those on the way to this moment now. I'm more comfortable with who I am now, with what I can offer the world and what I need to protect myself from. I know now better than ever what place being autistic plays in my life, and much of that knowledge comes from making mistakes. Of course, if I'd known about some of them in advance, the lessons learned might not have been quite so hard. Autismatic is a reflection of who I am right now and how I understand my place in the world as a middle-aged autistic man. It's the journey I took to get here and where I hope to end up, with all the hurdles I encounter on the way, and my perspective will continue to evolve as we all learn more about what makes us autistic. Whilst I'm always grateful for the huge positivity and support I get from YouTube comments, it's obvious from them alone that not everyone shares my view of the world, and some people really dislike me. But that just makes me human. All of us rub somebody up the wrong way, but when we're autistic, we seem to be very good at it. Do you suffer from unwanted guests at your parties or business functions? Come to Rent an Autist. We'll clear the room in record time or your money back. Working out how and why I encounter so much friction has taken me a lifetime, and likely won't stop until I draw my last breath. I've ballsed up in more ways than you can imagine, and I've torn myself to pieces over each and every misstep, but I've tried to learn from all of them. Everyone's life is a process of trial and error. We learn from the outcomes of every wager against the unpredictability of fate and the caprice of human nature. But when we're autistic, the dice are very definitely loaded in the house's favour. The odds of us winning are stacked against us, so any insider info, any lessons learned by others who had the same questions before us, are worth learning. I didn't know anyone who had trodden the path before me to reassure me, but I'd have given my eye teeth to have someone to turn to, even just to say, "Yeah, I know." Some things can only be learned with experience, but they're a lot less daunting when you know someone who's faced them before you. As I read back over all those comments and re-watched some of the videos you left them on, it became ever clearer that the path of the YouTuber wasn't for me. Most of you are autistic, so there's been no shortage of honesty, and you've told me in no uncertain terms what you like and dislike about the channel. I know what direction you want to see Autistic go in, and
be more YouTube
isn't on the list. Whilst YouTube may be my home, the changes I'd have to make to pursue that particular business model would turn Autistic into something unrecognisable. It would become a commercial entity vying for space in a market that will grow ever more crowded with voices recycling the same information over and again in homogenised, bite-sized, list-friendly chunks, just with different coloured backlighting to the last guy. What you all appear to want from me is also what I feel I'm best equipped to provide, but it's not what the commercial model of a business like YouTube demands. Who cares if someone can't find the video they want because the thumbnail and the title's changed? They might click on 5 other videos trying to find it, and that's 5 times the ads. Over and again, I've described how the transactional nature of modern society isn't compatible with my nature or that of most of the autistic people I've met. Whilst some of us cope and a few even thrive in fiercely competitive environments, sometimes even enjoying autistic-related advantages in their games of choice, the rest would like to just avoid all the toing and froing and jockeying for position in favour of a simple life. Following the path I describe as YouTuber puts me right back into the transactional again in many ways. I'm not talking about the basic transactions of capitalism here, that's not under discussion. The basic principle of earning one's way by exchanging something of value for money isn't in question. I want to make or do something that has value and earn a living wage in doing so. Autistic has been of more value to more people than anything I've done in my life or even imagined doing. But it's not earning the cheddar yet.
Be more YouTube
isn't right for me or the channel. But it's not the only way to make a living making content on here. Getting it to work is another huge gamble, though, on top of an ongoing wager with life I haven't seen the outcome of yet, and I'm not normally a gambling man. But we'll talk about that next time. I'm Quinn, and I'm autistic. Thank you for watching. If you've already liked and subscribed and would like to support the channel more, then please follow the Patreon links in the description to pledge what you feel is fair and affordable to help keep the lights on here and the content keep flowing.